The sunlight hit the black paint of that brand new SUV, and for a second it was so bright I had to squint. It wasn't the glare that stopped me, though. It was the temporary paper tag still stuck to the window. Kendra leaned against the driver's side door, her phone mounted on a tripod, live streaming to whoever was still buying the image she sold. She looked polished, successful, and entirely untouchable. I pulled my car into the lot, the gravel crunching beneath my tires. My Navy hospital operations jacket felt heavy against my shoulders, a sharp contrast to the expensive silk blouse Kendra wore. A new sign hung over the store entrance, under new ownership. It seemed smaller, somehow, like the building itself was shrinking. Kendra saw me. She didn't stop her stream. She just smoothed her hair and turned the camera my way, her smile tight. "Oh, look who decided to grace us with her presence," she said, her voice dripping with that rehearsed sweetness. "Don't look so grim, Julia. Grandma's gone, and the store paid for my car. You should be happy for me." I stepped out, the air smelling of hot asphalt and the faint, sweet decay of the late summer heat. I walked until I was 3 feet from her. I didn't look at the car. I didn't look at the camera. I just looked at Kendra. "Did you read the deed?" I asked. She laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that drew eyes from the handful of neighbors standing near the sidewalk. "You and your little documents, still clinging to the past." That store was a tomb, Julia. I made it a launch pad. I heard the shift in the air, the way the neighbors went quiet. Diane, my mother, hurried over from the store entrance, her hands wringing a paper napkin. "Julia, please," she whispered, not looking at me. "Don't do this. Today is about celebrating Kendra's success." I didn't turn my head. I didn't raise my voice. I just watched Kendra, who was busy checking her reflection in the side mirror, entirely convinced that she had finally won. She didn't know that 3 days earlier, Helen had called to confirm that a judge had signed the search and seizure warrants requested by Detectives Foster and Ross. She didn't know that the SUV she was leaning against had already been identified by its vehicle number in the seizure order. I turned away from her and walked back toward my car. My phone buzzed in my pocket with a message from Helen. I didn't need to read it yet. I'd been preparing for some version of this moment for 3 years, ever since the payroll discrepancies first appeared. During the past 2 weeks, Helen and I had preserved records, traced the closing documents, and given the investigators what they needed. The weight of the car keys in my hand felt solid and certain. I got into my car and backed out of the lot, leaving Kendra to her audience. I had work to do, and I didn't have time for another argument in a parking lot. The real fight had already moved into bank records, sworn documents, and a judge's signed orders. The engine turned over, steady and quiet. I wasn't just walking away from the store. I was walking away from the version of myself that had spent decades cleaning up other people's messes. As I drove toward the highway, the silence in the car was the first thing I'd truly owned in years. Kendra would have her audience for a little while longer, but the scene she was creating was already dead. It just didn't know it yet. My phone buzzed again, a second notification from Helen. I glanced down, just enough to see the message pop up beneath the first. They were taking the vehicle at 7 tomorrow morning. 3 years before that day in the parking lot, Mercer Market still held the scent of floor wax and overripe peaches. It was a Saturday morning, the kind that usually felt like a slow crawl through a swamp. I pulled into the gravel lot, my shoulders still tight from a 12-hour shift at the hospital. Curtis stood near the loading dock, wrestling with a pallet of canned corn that refused to cooperate. He looked tired. Not the tired that comes from a long day, but the kind that sinks into your marrow after years of lifting things that never get lighter. "Need a hand, Curtis?" I asked. He wiped his forehead with a grease-stained rag. "Julia, you shouldn't be here on your day off. Eleanor told you to stay home." "Eleanor doesn't always know what's best for her market," I said, moving to help him. We worked in silence for a while, the rhythm of lifting and stacking a familiar comfort. Working there wasn't just a favor to Grandma, it was the only way to keep the books from bleeding out. Every few weeks the payroll numbers would tilt, a subtle deviation that didn't add up. Kendra claimed it was an accounting glitch in the software, some invisible ghost in the machine that only she seemed to encounter. I wasn't a certified accountant, but I knew my way around a procurement log. I had seen enough supply chain discrepancies at the hospital to recognize when someone was skimming. Kendra's version of marketing expense often involved receipts that looked photocopied or suspiciously rounded to the nearest 50. "Did you see the new inventory report?" Curtis asked, his voice low. "I'm going to look at it now," I replied. I headed toward the back office. The air inside the store felt heavy, thick with the silence that had settled in since Grandma started spending more time in the upstairs apartment. When I pushed the office door open, Kendra was already there. She sat at the desk, her manicured fingers flying across the laptop keyboard. She didn't look up. "You're late," she said, not missing a beat. "I wasn't scheduled to be here, Kendra." "Well, you are now. And since you're here, help me with these marketing invoices. The Brightside Media representative is breathing down my neck." I moved behind her, scanning the screen. Brightside Media. That was Trent's company. I'd never seen a contract, and I certainly hadn't seen a single flyer or ad campaign that Trent had supposedly produced. The invoices were astronomical, 3 times what a local shop would charge. "What exactly are they doing for us?" I asked. Kendra sighed, that sharp, impatient sound that meant I was becoming a nuisance. "They're modernizing us, Julia. Grandma is stuck in the 1970s. If we don't pivot to digital, we're dead." "You're always so obsessed with every penny. Don't you want the business to grow?" "I want the business to survive. There's a difference." She finally turned. Her eyes narrowed. "You think you're better because you work at a hospital. You think you know how to run a business because you track supplies. But you don't have a vision. You don't have an eye for what people actually want." I didn't answer. I just watched her click over to a payroll tab. Lorna's name popped up. Her hours had been slashed by 4 hours this week, supposedly because the store was quiet. "Lorna was here until 8 on Tuesday," I said, my voice steady. "I stopped by to drop off Grandma's medicine. She was stocking the aisles." Kendra shrugged. "The computer logged her out. That's the system." I didn't argue. Arguing was a waste of breath when you were already looking at the truth. I simply took a photo of the screen with my phone, the shutter sound masked by the hum of the old refrigerator in the corner. That night, I sat in my townhouse, the silence echoing against the beige walls I'd painted myself. The space was small, barely enough for a sofa and a small dining table, but it was mine. No mortgages I couldn't handle, no emotional debts I hadn't agreed to pay. I opened a spreadsheet, one I'd started months ago, and typed in the numbers I'd pulled from the store's server. The discrepancies were growing. It wasn't just rounding errors anymore. I decided then that I would keep the spreadsheet running, preserve every original report, and verify each pay period against schedules and time cards. I would not accuse Kendra until I could prove the pattern, because an accusation without evidence would only make her erase the trail. But I would not let another employee lose wages while I waited. Any shortage I could confirm would be corrected through routine payroll reconciliation and documented in my private ledger. 2 months later, I found myself sitting in a conference room at the community college. The workshop topic was simple: protecting assets from digital fraud. A gray-haired man stood at the front, his slide deck filled with red font and warnings. "You think your home is safe because you pay the taxes?" he said, gesturing to a screen showing a county recorder's office. "But it takes 5 minutes to file a fraudulent deed. Once that title is clouded, you're looking at years of litigation." I raised my hand. "Is there a way to know immediately?" "County alerts," he answered. "Register your property. You get an email the second a document is filed with your name on it." I registered Mercer Market that night. I didn't tell Grandma. She was already fading, the long afternoons leaving her confused and tired. She didn't need to know that I was watching the digital records, waiting for the moment when someone might try to cut us out of our own history. "You're too cautious, Julia," she told me one evening, her hand trembling as she held her tea. We were sitting on the porch, the cicadas humming a desperate song in the late August heat. "Kendra is young. She just needs guidance." "She doesn't want guidance, Grandma," I said, but I kept my voice soft. I didn't want to break the frail peace she had built around herself. "She's family," she murmured, her eyes drifting toward the driveway where Kendra's car was parked. "Family is all we have. You're the strong one, Julia. You'll be the one to hold it all together." That was the trap, wasn't it? The belief that strength was defined by how much you could absorb before you collapsed. I didn't want to be the strong one. I wanted to be a person, not a pillar. 3 weeks before she passed, the air in the store felt different. Colder somehow. She called me into the office, the back room where the filing cabinets were lined up like headstones. She looked smaller in her high-backed chair, the blue binder on her lap acting like a shield. "When the time comes," she said, her voice raspy but clear, "read every line. Kendra will try to take the store. She'll try to take everything because she thinks she deserves the spotlight, not the foundation." She pressed the binder into my hands. The cover was cool to the touch, a deep, professional blue that felt heavy with intent. "Don't let her turn it into a ghost," Grandma added, closing her eyes. "It doesn't belong to the loudest person in the room." I held the binder until my knuckles went white. I wanted to ask her what she meant, what she had found, but she was already drifting into sleep. I left the store and drove home, the binder resting in the passenger seat like a live wire. I didn't open it that night. I was too terrified of what it might demand of me. But I knew one thing. I was ready. I had my own place, my own money, and a paper trail that Kendra didn't even know existed. I had spent 3 years preparing for a storm that she still believed was just a gentle breeze. I stood by my window, watching the streetlights flicker on. My phone vibrated another alert, just a routine tax assessment update for the market. I cleared it, my thumb hovering over the app I had used to monitor the deed records. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. The document was still filed under Grandma's name, still secure. For now. But the way Kendra had been looking at the property survey on the store, computer kept me awake until the sun began to bleed over the horizon. I had the binder. I had the alerts. And for the first time, I realized that I wasn't waiting for the storm. I was waiting for the perfect moment to redirect it. The morning after Grandma's funeral, the county alert arrived with one line in red. "Ownership transfer recorded." My chest tightened, a cold weight settling behind my ribs. I pulled up the county recorder's website, the blue light of the screen harsh in the dim kitchen. Grantee, Northgate Urban Development. Grantor, Kendra Mercer. Trustee of the Mercer Employee Preservation Trust. My hands felt numb. Kendra had no authority to sell. She wasn't even a trustee. I closed the tab, forced myself to take a steady breath, and reached for the blue binder. It had sat on my counter for 5 days, a silent witness to the grief I hadn't yet been able to fully process. I opened it, the pages stiff and smelling of old paper and peppermint. Inside, the trust agreement lay flat. Page 12 clearly listed Eleanor Mercer as the initial trustee and me, Julia Mercer, as the sole successor trustee. The document explicitly stated that the trust was irrevocable, meaning once the building and the market were transferred into it 5 years ago, they belonged to the trust beneficiaries, not the family. I traced the signature line with my thumb. Everything was there, mapped out in legal prose, protecting the market from exactly the kind of greed Kendra lived to cultivate. I dialed Helen Ward's number. She answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and professional. "Julia," she said, recognizing my tone immediately. "What's happened?" "Kendra filed a deed," I said, keeping my voice low. "She sold the store to Northgate. She signed it as trustee." A heavy silence followed. I could hear the rustle of papers on Helen's end. "That's impossible, Julia. She isn't the trustee. You are." "She filed a certification of trust," I explained, the words feeling like dry stones in my mouth. "She claimed she was the successor." Helen's breath hitched. "Meet me at my office in 1 hour. Bring the binder. If she's done what I think she's done, she's not just broken a family rule, she's committed a felony." I spent the next hour gathering every document that proved my identity as the successor trustee. I pulled the death certificate, my own written acceptance of the role, and the original trust instrument. I felt a strange sense of clarity, a detachment that allowed me to move with precision. I wasn't just a sister anymore. I was a fiduciary with a duty to protect 6 people who had spent their lives working for a dream Kendra was currently trying to auction off for an SUV. Helen's office smelled of expensive leather and dust. She looked over the documents I provided, her eyes scanning the lines with surgical intensity. When she finished, she sighed, pushing her glasses up onto her forehead. "She's built a house of cards, Julia," Helen said. She filed a certification of trust and an affidavit of successor trustee. Those documents are essentially sworn statements. If she knew they were false, she's committed fraud. I need to stop the sale, I said. Northgate is a developer. They don't care about family squabbles, but they do care about title insurance, Helen explained. They rely on the title company to verify the seller's authority. If we prove that authority doesn't exist, the deal falls apart. But you have to be careful. You are the trustee, but you haven't been formally recognized by the bank or the county yet. We need to file your acceptance and death certificate immediately to formalize your position. Do it, I said. We spent the afternoon drafting preservation notices. We sent them to the title company, the escrow firm, and the developer's legal department. We informed them that the transaction was based on fraudulent representations of trustee authority. I watched Helen's assistant copy the packets, each page a brick in the wall I was building between my sister and the legacy she sought to dismantle. Driving back to the market, I felt the familiar weight of the responsibility Grandma had placed on my shoulders. I looked at the names listed as beneficiaries on the trust instrument: Lorna, Curtis, Maribel, Denise, Wayne, Gloria. These weren't just employees. They were the people who had stood by the market when the neighborhood changed and the foot traffic dwindled. They were the ones Kendra had been stealing from in increments of 4 hours here and a missed bonus there. My phone rang. It was Diane. "Julia, where are you?" she asked, her voice tight. "Kendra is furious. She says you're making legal threats to the buyer. She's grieving, and you're acting like a vulture." "I'm protecting the trust, Mom," I said. I kept my grip on the steering wheel until my hands ached. "Kendra isn't the trustee. She's selling property she doesn't own." "She's Eleanor's granddaughter," Diane shouted. "She's trying to secure our future. Why are you so obsessed with rules? You've always been the strong one, Julia. Why can't you just use that strength to support your sister instead of destroying her?" "I'm not destroying her," I replied. "I'm stopping a theft." I ended the call before she could scream again. I didn't want to hear the familiar refrain of how I was supposed to sacrifice my integrity to keep the family mask from cracking. The next morning, I arrived at Helen's office to review the response from the title company. An officer named Allison Reed had sent over a packet. It contained the fraudulent certification Kendra had submitted. I laid it out on the mahogany desk, my heart drumming against my ribs. Kendra had taken the original certification, scanned it, and used software to delete my name from the successor slot, replacing it with her own. She had even removed the entire section detailing the 6 beneficiaries. Helen pointed to the altered page. "This wasn't a misunderstanding, Julia. Someone rebuilt the document to erase you." I leaned in, examining the fine lines of the text. It was so clean, so deliberate. Kendra had sat down, opened her laptop, and systematically deleted the rights of 6 people she called her friends. "Can we prove she did it?" I asked. "We have the original," Helen said, gesturing to the blue binder. "And now we have the copy she submitted. The metadata may help show when and how the file was altered, but the stronger proof will come from the email chain and a forensic copy of the device used to create it. But more importantly, we have the email chain." Helen turned the page to show me a series of messages between the title officer and Kendra. In one email, the officer had clearly asked if there were other named successor, trustees, or beneficiaries. Kendra's reply was short and final. "The trust is straightforward. I am the sole person with authority to manage the assets. There are no other parties involved." I felt a sudden, sharp ache behind my eyes. She had been warned. She had been given the chance to stop. "She lied in writing," I whispered. "Yes," Helen said. "She lied to secure a transaction involving hundreds of thousands of dollars. That is exactly what we need." I looked at the window, watching the traffic pass by in the blurred, indifferent light. Kendra thought I was the cold one. She thought I was the sister who lacked a heart because I preferred documents to drama. But as I looked at those 6 names she had tried to erase, I knew I was the only one who had actually seen them. Kendra only ever saw reflections of herself in the people around her. "What's the next step?" I asked. "We submit this to the Financial Crimes Unit of the local police department," Helen said. "We don't need to begin with a public lawsuit. We need investigators to freeze whatever money remains, preserve the financial records, and stop her from moving assets or pressuring the witnesses. I left the office with the copy of the forged certification in my bag. I wasn't going to call Kendra. I wasn't going to fight with Mom. I was going to let the machinery of the law do exactly what it was designed to do. Turn the page Kendra had tried to hide into the center of the investigation. The market was quiet when I drove past it later that day, the signs still proclaiming new ownership. It looked like a tomb, just like Kendra had said. But tombs had foundations, and I was finally ready to start digging. Lorna sat across from me in a booth at the back of Miller's Diner, her hands wrapped tight around a mug of lukewarm coffee. Her knuckles were white. She looked like she was waiting for a storm to break, the kind that might wash away everything she had spent her life building. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice barely rising above the hum of the overhead lights. "The sale? They say Kendra already signed the papers." "The papers are signed, Lorna," I said, choosing my words with the care of someone walking over thin ice. "But the person who signed them had no legal authority to do so. That's why we're here." I didn't offer her false comfort. I didn't tell her it would be over in a week or that the store would be exactly as she remembered it. I explained the trust, the irrevocable nature of Grandma's plan, and the fact that I was currently the only person with the fiduciary duty to hold the line. Lorna didn't look relieved. She looked terrified. "Kendra told us it was for the best," Lorna whispered. "She said the store was failing, that we'd all be out of jobs anyway. She promised us a severance package if we just stayed quiet and signed the paperwork." "Did you sign anything?" I asked. Lorna shook her head. "Gloria and I held off. We wanted to talk to you. But Maribel and Denise? They were so scared, Julia. They signed." The news felt like a physical blow. Kendra hadn't just forged my name, she had been actively dismantling the beneficiaries one by one, picking off the ones who were most vulnerable. I pulled my notebook out, my pen hovering over the page. I needed facts, not hearsay. I needed to know exactly what Kendra had put in front of them. "I need you to keep every pay stub you have," I told her. "Every text, every email, every scrap of paper she gave you. If she offered a severance, there must be a document. We need to see it." Curtis was harder to reach. When I finally found him at his small house on the edge of town, he was already packing boxes into his trunk. He thought he was being fired. He thought his time at Mercer Market had ended in a parking lot confrontation he wasn't invited to. "I can't fight, Julia," Curtis said, leaning against his rusted sedan. "I'm 65. Who's going to hire me now?" "You don't have to fight Kendra, Curtis," I said, keeping my tone firm. "I am the one fighting her. All you have to do is stay put. Don't sign anything else. If she calls, you tell her you've spoken to your lawyer. If you don't have one, you use Helen Ward's number." He looked at me for a long minute, his eyes searching mine for the cracks he'd seen in my sister. He didn't find them. "You sound just like Eleanor," he muttered. "She always told me you'd be the one to save the place when the vultures started circling." "I'm not saving it for me," I said. "I'm saving it for you." I spent the next 3 days moving through the lives of the 6 beneficiaries like a ghost. Each meeting felt like gathering shards of a broken mirror. Maribel was convinced I was going to get her sued. Gloria was just plain angry. Her face flushed as she described how Kendra had cornered her in the stockroom, demanding a signature on a document labeled "Consent to Liquidate." The most jarring discovery came from Denise. She pulled out a photo she had taken on her phone, a blurry shot of a document Kendra had left on the break room table. I zoomed in on the signature line. Below the space for the beneficiaries to sign, there was a single sentence hidden under where Kendra's hand had been resting in the photo: "Consent to liquidate trust property." My stomach churned. Kendra had known exactly what she was doing. She knew about the trust. She knew about the beneficiaries. She had planned to systematically liquidate the property and vanish with the proceeds before I even finished the funeral arrangements. "She thought we wouldn't notice the fine print," Denise said, her lip trembling. "She said it was just a technicality, just to update the company insurance." I saved the image to my phone and encrypted the file. I was starting to see the true scale of the fraud. It wasn't just a sudden impulse, it was a campaign. Midway through the week, a certified letter arrived from Northgate's legal team. They were demanding that the staff vacate the premises within 14 days so the demolition surveys could begin. I read the notice twice. the cold, clinical language designed to intimidate people who didn't know their rights. I sat at my desk and drafted a formal response, signing it as the successor trustee. I sent it via courier to their main office, knowing it would land on the desk of someone who was likely expecting a tearful resignation from the staff. When the news of my response reached Kendra, she didn't call. She posted a video. I was at the hospital, grabbing a quick cup of coffee, when a colleague tapped my shoulder and held up a phone. Kendra was on screen, standing in front of the store, her hair windblown and her face set in a mask of calculated outrage. "My sister is trying to tear down the community," she told the camera, her voice hitting that perfect practiced note of grief. "She's keeping the store closed and stagnant because she's jealous of my success. She doesn't care about the staff. She only cares about her own ego. If you've ever walked into Mercer Market and felt like you were at home, tell Julia to stop sabotaging the progress we deserve." The comment section was a swarm. People who had never stepped foot in the store were calling me names, demanding I step aside, praising Kendra for her courage. I didn't respond. I didn't comment. I saved the video, captured the account name and timestamp, and sent the original link to Helen with a request that it be formally preserved. Kendra was providing more evidence of her intent with every word she spoke. That night, I sat down with Wayne, our bookkeeper. He looked exhausted, his desk covered in stacks of printouts. He pointed a shaking finger at a spreadsheet he had been working on. "Look at these adjustments, Julia," he whispered. "Those are my initials." But I wasn't even in the store on those dates. I was in the hospital, having my knee replaced. Kendra had my login. She had the access. I felt the last piece of the puzzle click into place. The red herring I had been tracking for years, the missing money, the accounting errors had always pointed back to the same source. Kendra had been using Wayne's credentials to hide her tracks, knowing that if the auditors ever dug deep, the trail would lead straight to his desk. "Keep these prints, Wayne," I said, my voice barely audible over the hum of the office lights. "Keep them safe. You're not the one who's going to be in trouble for this." I walked out into the cool evening air, the parking lot silent and dark. I looked at the store, at the new sign Kendra had installed. It wasn't a tomb yet, it was a witness, and the people who had given their lives to it were finally ready to tell the truth. I had the names, the dates, and the proof of the intent. The demolition might be delayed, but Kendra's destruction had already begun. Helen Ward handed me a thick manila envelope, the edges worn from handling. Inside lay the closing checklist Allison Reed had finally surrendered. I spread the pages across the mahogany desk, the paper crisp and smelling of freshly printed ink. It was a roadmap of negligence. "Allison actually asked about other beneficiaries," Helen noted, tapping a specific email printed in the middle of the stack. She sent this to Kendra 3 days before the closing. She wanted a full certification, not just a one-page summary. I read the reply Kendra had sent. It was composed, confident, and entirely fictitious. My sister had insisted that the trust was simple, that no other beneficiaries existed, and that she alone held the keys to the kingdom. Allison had pushed, requesting to speak with the attorney who drafted the original trust, but Kendra had claimed Helen was unreachable due to a family emergency. "She weaponized the timing of the funeral," I whispered. "She did," Helen agreed. "And the title company didn't push harder because they were desperate to close a high-value commercial deal. They committed professional negligence, Julia, but they didn't commit fraud. That's a distinction that will keep them from being indicted, but it won't stop them from losing their reputation once this hits the public record." I moved to the bank trail report next. The money had arrived in an account labeled Mercer Preservation Holdings, a name close enough to the real trust to deceive a busy escrow clerk, but distinct enough to hold Kendra's loot. Within 24 hours, the funds had scattered like seeds in a storm. Payments flowed to the SUV dealership, to Trent's LLC, and into a dozen smaller accounts I didn't recognize. "This is where we bring in the professionals," Helen said. I took the packet to Detective Foster at the local precinct 2 days later. He sat in a small office that smelled of stale coffee and printer toner. He didn't interrupt while I walked him through the timeline. I laid out the deed, the trust instrument, the certification Kendra had fabricated, and the bank transfers. I didn't frame it as a sisterly dispute. I framed it as a financial crime, involving 6 victims and millions of dollars in assets. You've done the heavy lifting, Julia, Foster said, his voice measured. Most people come in here with nothing but accusations. You've brought me a paper trail. It's not just a trail, I said. It's a pattern. That evening, Diane showed up at my townhouse without calling. She stood in the doorway, staring at the sparse, clean furniture I had chosen for myself. She looked around like she was searching for the daughter who used to prioritize family needs over everything else. Kendra is crying, Diane said, her eyes glassy. She says you're using the police to harass her over a business decision. Why can't you just solve this at the dinner table like adults? Because adults don't steal from their friends, Mom, I said. I'm not trying to hurt Kendra. I'm trying to stop a thief. And if you keep enabling her, you're just making the fall longer when it finally happens. She left in a huff, her silhouette framed by the porch light. I locked the door and went back to my laptop. The latest reports from the investigation were trickling in, and the digital footprint was growing wider. Kendra had been sloppy. She thought she was building an empire, but she was only leaving behind a map of every mistake she'd ever made. I looked at the shared folder, linked to Brightside Media, where Trent had been busy dumping digital marketing invoices for work that had never been performed. Every click, every timestamp, every fraudulent entry was just one more layer of evidence. The lie was so heavy, it was starting to collapse under its own weight. Wayne paced the length of my kitchen, his hospital discharge papers clutched in one hand and a thick stack of printouts in the other. He had been our bookkeeper for 2 decades, a man who treated every decimal point like a sacred vow. Seeing him this agitated felt like watching the ground lose its gravity. I spent the morning going through the server logs, Julia, he said, his voice straining with suppressed fury. My credentials were used to dump payroll hours from every single beneficiary account. They were altered during the exact window I was in surgery. He slapped the printouts onto the table. One set showed the payroll as it should have been, reflecting years of faithful service from Lorna, Maribel, and the others. The second set revealed the tampered version, where hours had been bled away to create a surplus that moved directly into the Brightside Media invoice queue. It was clinical, cold, and devastatingly precise. These initials here, Wayne pointed to the bottom of the modified sheets. They aren't mine. They were forged using the internal system's digital stamp, but the audit trail shows the physical access occurred on the desktop located in the main office, the office Kendra uses. I felt a surge of cold triumph mingling with the persistent ache of family betrayal. This was the missing link. For years, I had quietly made up the difference when the store's budget tightened, dipping into my own savings to ensure Lorna and the rest received their full pay. I had protected them from the scarcity, but in doing so, I had inadvertently shielded Kendra from the consequences of her theft. I had kept the store quiet and functional, allowing her to believe she was untouchable. Lorna stood by the window, her eyes wet as she looked at the proof of what had been stolen from her. I trusted her, Julia. We all did. She acted like she was just updating the software to make things easier for us. She wasn't updating, I said, my voice cutting through the heavy air. She was clearing the shelves. The next day, I brought Gloria and Maribel into the office for a final verification. Gloria pulled out her phone and opened a saved photo. It was a clear shot of a document Kendra had shoved at her months ago, demanding a signature under the guise of an insurance update. I zoomed in on the file, my heart hammering against my chest. Below the signature line, hidden by a thumb, the words, "Consent to liquidate trust property," were visible in crisp, black type. The phone rang just as I finished documenting the photo. Kendra's name flashed on the screen. A jarring interruption to the quiet gathering of evidence. I answered, putting the device on speaker so Wayne and the others could hear. "Julia, we need to talk," she said, her tone dropping into that syrupy, manipulative register she usually reserved for public events. "People are starting to get the wrong idea. If you just step back, we can settle this. I'll cut you a check for $100,000 and you can go back to your hospital job. Just stop confusing the staff." "A check?" I asked, keeping my tone intentionally flat. "Why don't you send me an email detailing the terms of this offer, Kendra?" She went silent. I knew she was thinking, calculating the danger of putting her extortion in writing. "Just stop, Julia," she spat, the mask finally slipping. "You have no idea what you've started." She hung up, but it didn't matter. The conversation wasn't about the money, it was about the confirmation. She had just offered me a bribe to walk away from a trust she knew she had illegally dismantled. Wayne looked at me, a weary smile touching his lips. We had the payroll trail, the fraudulent consent form, and now the admission of a bribe. The walls were closing in, and she had built every single one of them herself. 7 in the morning in Bellwether usually meant nothing more than the sound of distant lawnmowers or the heavy tread of the garbage truck making its rounds. But today, the air felt tight, charged with an electricity that made the fine hairs on my arms stand straight up. A tow truck pulled into the drive of Kendra's house, its hydraulics hissing as the flatbed lowered toward the pavement. I sat in my sedan across the street, accompanied by Helen. We weren't here to intervene. We were here to witness the legal gears finally grinding into motion. Kendra emerged from the front door a moment later, still wearing a silk robe, her face a confused map of outrage. She started yelling, pointing a manicured finger at the driver, but the man didn't even look up. He moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had a warrant in his pocket and a job to finish. "What is this?" Kendra screamed, her voice cracking as the driver backed the SUV onto the metal ramp. "This is private property. I'll sue everyone involved in this, do you hear me?" 2 detectives, Foster and Ross, stepped out of an unmarked vehicle that had pulled in behind the tow truck. They didn't rush. They didn't shout. They simply walked toward her, holding a folder that held the weight of everything Kendra had tried to bury. I watched the scene unfold through the windshield, the realization hitting me that the woman standing on that lawn wasn't the powerful influencer she pretended to be. She was just a person who had finally run out of fabrications. "Kendra Mercer," Detective Foster said, his voice calm enough to be heard over the idling engine. "We have a seizure warrant for this vehicle and a search warrant for the residence. We're going to need your cooperation." Kendra turned her gaze toward my car. She saw me through the glass, and for a fleeting second, the rage vanished, replaced by a raw, naked panic. She bolted toward my side of the street, but Detective Ross stepped into her path, his presence acting like a wall of reinforced concrete. She didn't get near me. She didn't get near the answers she wanted. She just stood there, caught between the loss of her prized possession and the reality of the authorities standing on her porch. I looked at Helen. My lawyer didn't say a word, just watched the detectives enter the house to begin the search for the laptop and the financial documents that would verify the payroll theft. "You did this to me," Kendra wailed, her voice echoing off the suburban houses. I didn't answer. I didn't step out of the car. I stayed behind the glass, the cool air of the cabin protecting me from the chaos outside. I hadn't orchestrated this, and I hadn't made the calls. I had simply waited for the truth to be heavy enough that the system couldn't ignore it anymore. Diane's car screeched to a halt behind mine a few minutes later. She tumbled out, her face pale, running toward the detectives with the desperation of someone who still believed she could bargain with reality. I watched my mother plead, watched her try to shield Kendra from the process, and felt nothing but a dull, lingering ache. She was still trying to keep the family mask intact, even as the detectives carried boxes of evidence out the front door. By the time the SUV was strapped down and ready to depart, the neighbors were all outside. They were filming, their phones held high, capturing the moment the woman who sold her grandmother's legacy watched it get towed away. That evening, the digital echo chamber began its work. The video of the car being taken, the very vehicle Kendra had bragged about in her live stream as a reward for selling the store, was everywhere. It traveled from social media accounts to community boards, the caption about the store paying for the car being shared alongside images of the tow truck. I didn't need to post a single word. The public was doing the work for me, their curiosity fueled by the irony of her own hubris. Detective Foster called me 2 days later. His voice was tired but satisfied. "The forensic review is ongoing, Julia," he said, tapping on his desk. "But we found the file structure on the laptop. The certification of trust was modified before your grandmother even passed away. The metadata is all there. We've also got the folder synced with Brightside Media. It's all there, every single line of it." I hung up the phone and looked out my window. The sun was setting over the townhouse complex, the light casting long, sharp shadows across the parking lot. Kendra thought she was in control, but she had been living in a house she built with stolen bricks. I finally allowed myself to breathe, the tension that had lived in my shoulders for months beginning to loosen. The legal wheels were turning, and there was nothing left for me to do but wait for the inevitable halt of her world. Kendra filed her civil claim 2 weeks after the seizure. A desperate, loud legal motion that accused me of isolating Grandma, coercing her into the trust arrangement, and stealing the family legacy through manipulation. The motion was a masterpiece of fiction, weaving together my years of caretaking into a narrative of calculated psychological abuse. She claimed that Grandma had been suffering from cognitive decline for years, making the 5-year-old trust document invalid. Diane stopped speaking to me altogether, convinced that I had finally snapped and turned my resentment into a legal weapon. I became the villain in the family group chat, the greedy daughter who had used her position at the hospital to manipulate a dying woman. The public pressure began to mount, fueled by local news outlets who loved the framing of a sisters at war drama. Helen sat me down in her office the afternoon the claim was served. She didn't look worried. She looked like a surgeon about to perform a routine excision. "She's betting on the idea that we can't prove Eleanor's mental state 5 years ago," Helen said, tapping the lawsuit. "But she's forgotten that Eleanor was a very organized woman." Helen produced a video recording. It was a file I hadn't even known existed until that moment. The screen flickered to life, showing Grandma sitting at a wooden desk in a room filled with sunlight. She looked sharp, energetic, and entirely in command of her faculties. A notary sat across from her, recording the date and the purpose of the meeting. The video lasted 40 minutes, an exhaustive walkthrough of why Eleanor was placing the store into an irrevocable trust. She didn't just mention the market. She laid out her concerns about Kendra's spending habits and her desire to protect the 6 employees who had kept the doors open for decades. "I want to make sure the store outlives my own mistakes," Eleanor said in the video, her gaze steady as she looked into the lens. "And I want to make sure it outlives the greed of those who see it only as an exit strategy." The notary log was equally damning. We had 2 independent witnesses who had signed the declaration, both of whom had been friends of Grandma for years but held no stake in the outcome. They testified that they had spoken with her for over an hour before the signing, discussing everything from her gardening to her political frustrations, all to ensure she was fully aware of the legal weight of her actions. I refused to give the press an interview. Instead, Helen released a short, neutral statement confirming that the trust was irrevocable and that all assets remained under the legal management of the named successor trustee for the benefit of the store's employees. The narrative of me being a greedy sister withered in the face of the dry, boring, and undeniably legal truth. I wasn't getting rich. I wasn't the owner. I was the person holding the keys for people who actually showed up to work. That was when the real cracks in Kendra's armor appeared. Trent Maddox, her boyfriend and the supposed architect of her marketing genius, realized that the police were closing in on the Brightside Media records. He didn't wait for a subpoena. He showed up at the local precinct with his own attorney, hoping that by volunteering the information, he might walk away with his own reputation intact. He didn't hold anything back. He handed over a drive containing a shared folder, invoices that were blatantly fabricated, and a transcript of text that mapped out the betrayal from the start. I listened to the voice message Trent provided, my phone resting on the kitchen counter like a ticking bomb. Kendra's voice came through, soft and conspiratorial, a sharp contrast to the aggressive tone she used in the courtroom. "Julia is too focused on the medicine and the nursing home logistics to notice the filing changes," she said in the recording, dated 2 months before Grandma's passing. "The Northgate deal needs a clean slate. Once the certification is signed and filed, she won't even realize the ownership has shifted until the funds are cleared. She's too busy being the good granddaughter to check the county records." The sound of her laughter on the recording was the most chilling thing I had ever heard. She had watched me carry the burden of Grandma's decline. She had seen me sacrifice my weekends and my sleep, and she had used that very sacrifice as cover for her theft. She had trusted that I would be the good granddaughter, never realizing that being good didn't mean being blind. I sat in the dark of my kitchen, the recording ending, leaving a silence that felt heavy and absolute. I finally understood that she had never been desperate. She had been precise. She had been playing a game where I was the only one following the rules, assuming that if I did the right thing, the universe would eventually balance the scales. I had been wrong. The universe didn't balance anything. People did, provided they had the evidence and the resolve to see the process through to the end. I sent the file to Helen and turned off my phone, the weight of the last few years finally beginning to lift. The storm hadn't just passed, it had wiped the landscape clean. The civil hearing felt like a slow walk through a graveyard. The judge sat high above us, his face a mask of weary neutrality as Helen laid out the deed, the original trust agreement, and the undeniable evidence that Kendra had no authority to sell Mercer Market. Northgate's legal team sat across the aisle, their posture defensive. They had realized months ago that their title commitment was a hollow shell, built on the shifting sand of my sister's lies. When their representative finally stood to admit their oversight, he didn't try to defend the sale. He simply pointed at the certification Kendra had notarized and admitted that their due diligence team had failed to look beneath the surface of the document. I watched Kendra from the back of the courtroom. She looked smaller than I remembered, her expensive clothes hanging loosely on her frame. The bravado she used to wear like armor now stripped away. She didn't look at me. She spent the entire hearing staring at the floor, her fingers picking at the fabric of her coat until the seams threatened to unravel. It took more than a year for the civil settlement to crystallize. Northgate eventually signed a quitclaim deed, returning the title to the irrevocable trust, effectively acknowledging that the initial transaction had been a void act. The title insurance company paid a staggering sum to cover the developers' losses, a price they were willing to pay to avoid a protracted trial that would expose their internal verification failures to the entire industry. During the civil phase, Lorna and Wayne gave sworn testimony about the trust and the missing payroll funds. Lorna spoke with the quiet clarity of someone who had been robbed not only of money, but of dignity. Wayne presented the original reports beside the altered versions and explained how Kendra had used his credentials while he was hospitalized. Their testimony helped secure the return of the property and the restoration of the beneficiaries' rights. It did not determine Kendra's criminal sentence. That process continued separately. Months later, prosecutors relied on the same authenticated records in the criminal case. They presented the false trustee certification, Kendra's deceptive emails to the title company, the fraudulent bank account, the payroll audit trail, and the transfers leading directly to her debts, Brightside Media, and the SUV. No single document proved everything. Each piece established one part of the scheme, and together they left her with no credible explanation. A few months later, during the plea negotiation, Diane found me in the hallway outside the courtroom. Her eyes were rimmed with red, her composure finally shattered by the reality of the courtroom proceedings. "She's ready to admit it, Julia," Diane whispered, pulling at my sleeve as if she could tether herself to me. "She'll tell the judge everything. Just please, don't make them give her the maximum. She's your sister. We're all that's left." "I'm not the one deciding her sentence, Mom," I said, pulling away gently. "The evidence is deciding it. She had every chance to stop, and every single time she chose to keep lying." The plea hearing was the final act. Kendra stood before the judge, her head bowed as the prosecutor read the terms of the agreement. 4 years in state prison, full restitution of the stolen payroll funds, forfeiture of every asset traced to the fraudulent sale, permanent removal from any role involving the Mercer Trust, and a 10-year prohibition on holding fiduciary employment after her release. As the judge asked if she understood the terms, a heavy silence descended. Kendra hesitated, her gaze drifting toward me. For a fleeting second, the old pattern flickered in her eyes, that desperate, childlike expectation that I would step in and fix the disaster she had manufactured. She waited for me to speak, to rescue her from the consequences of her own choices. I stood still, my hands clasped in front of me, and gave her nothing. I didn't offer a nod of forgiveness, and I didn't offer a word of comfort. I simply watched her realize that, for the first time in our lives, the silence was mine to keep. The judge's gavel sounded like a final door closing. 4 years in a state facility, followed by a long road of restitution payments. The courtroom emptied out, the air feeling thin and stale, as if the oxygen had been drained by the sheer weight of the sentencing. Kendra didn't look back as the bailiff led her away, her posture rigid, her world distilled down to the concrete walls that would define her life for the next stretch of time. I walked out into the sunlight of the courthouse steps, squinting against the harsh glare of a clear July afternoon. My townhouse felt too quiet that night. I sat at my small dining table, the one I had chosen because it fit perfectly into the corner of my own separate life. The blue binder sat in front of me, its task finally completed. I had retrieved it from the safe, and for a moment I considered shredding it, turning the paper trail of my family's betrayal into confetti. Instead, I placed it back inside the metal box and locked it away. It wasn't a trophy. It was a record. Mercer Market reopened 3 months later, just after the transition from the legal settlement to actual operations was finalized. We didn't throw a grand party. We didn't put up a banner. We simply unlocked the door and turned the sign to open. The shelves looked different, cleaner, managed by a professional who knew how to balance the books without shaving off pennies from the people who did the real work. I had hired him, vetted his resume, and checked his references, but I stayed in the background. I was the trustee, not the shopkeeper. I collected my fiduciary fee, filed the term, but I never once walked into the break room to tell anyone how to run their business. Diane stopped by the store once, her face still shadowed by the grief of losing a daughter to a prison sentence and another to the firm boundary I had drawn. She stood in the produce aisle, looking at the fresh tomatoes, then turned to me. "Can we ever just be a family again?" she asked, her voice trembling. I looked at her, seeing the woman who had spent decades asking me to absorb the consequences of someone else's malice. "We can be people who know each other, Mom, but I won't ever be the one keeping the family mask in place again. That time is gone." She left without another word. I didn't chase her. The relief of that realization hit me with more force than any victory in a courtroom. I had spent so much of my life waiting for a different ending, one where we were all happy and the secret stayed buried, but that version of us had never actually existed. We were just a collection of habits, expectations, and long-standing lies, and breaking them had been the only way to breathe. My work in hospital procurement remained a sanctuary. Purchase orders had dates, deliveries had tracking numbers. When supplies went missing, no one asked me to ignore the discrepancy because the vendor was family. We traced the records, corrected the failure, and protected the people depending on us. I found comfort in that clarity. My coworkers needed me to be competent, present, and fair. They never asked me to absorb someone else's chaos to keep an illusion alive. The evidence was there for everyone to see, and the resolution was about the slow, grueling process of healing. I found a strange comfort in the consistency of it. The machines blinked with a reliable rhythm, and the patients didn't ask me to be their sister, or their keeper, or the one who absorbed their chaos. They just needed me to be competent, present, and fair. One Saturday morning, I walked past the market on my way to the hospital. A customer was standing by the entrance, scrolling through their phone with a grin. I slowed down, curiosity piqued by the familiarity of the movement. She was looking at a social media post, her thumb hovering over the screen. It was one of the last things Kendra had ever posted, a high-resolution photograph of her leaning against the SUV, that practiced, superior smile on her lips, paired with a caption that had once felt like a flex. "Finally, getting what I deserve." The customer tapped the screen, unaware that the caption had become a prophecy. The SUV was long gone, liquidated to satisfy a portion of the court-ordered restitution. The brand deals were gone. The reputation was a cautionary tale people used to warn their children against the dangers of building a life on stolen ground. The irony was so perfect, so complete, that I almost stopped to explain it to her, but I kept walking. I reached the hospital doors and looked back one last time. The market was humming with activity, the employees moving with a lightness I hadn't seen in years. They were building something sustainable, something that belonged to them, and for the first time in a long time, the weight on my chest was entirely absent. I pushed the heavy glass doors open, the scent of antiseptic and sterile air meeting me like a fresh start. Kendra had been right about one thing. The store had paid for her SUV. It had paid for the greed, the arrogance, and the temporary rush of being the loudest person in the room. But it had also paid for the evidence that took everything else away, including the burden I had been carrying since I was a child. I didn't inherit Grandma's store. I inherited the responsibility to stop one person from stealing what 6 others had spent their lives building. For the first time, I carried that responsibility without carrying my family's lies with it. I clipped my badge to my jacket and stepped into the morning operations briefing, returning to the quiet, predictable rhythm of a life that was finally entirely my own. The morning deliveries were arriving, and my team needed me. And for the first time in my 38 years, I didn't feel like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. The floor was solid beneath my feet, and I had nowhere else to be. You might think that keeping the peace is the ultimate act of love, but look at how easily that silence can become a shroud for someone else's greed. When you spend your life absorbing the consequences of someone else's choices, you aren't just being a good sister or a dutiful daughter. You are actively fueling the very behavior that will eventually consume the people you are trying to protect. True strength isn't found in how much chaos you can manage without complaining, nor is it measured by how many fires you can extinguish in the dark while no one else is watching. It is found in the moment you realize that enabling isn't kindness, it is a betrayal of yourself and the people who rely on your integrity. Protecting a family legacy doesn't mean standing in the debris of broken promises to hide the cracks. It means holding everyone accountable so that something honest can finally be built. If you find yourself constantly balancing the scales for a family member who refuses to stand on their own, you have to ask yourself what price you are paying for that fragile, superficial stability. You deserve a life defined by your own choices, rather than by the emergencies and deceptions of someone who views your reliability as a resource to be exhausted. It takes a terrifying amount of courage to draw a line, especially when that line forces the people you love to finally face the wreckage they've created, but that clarity is the only thing that can set you free. Holding that boundary doesn't make you the villain of the story, even if those who benefit from your silence will do everything they can to convince you otherwise. You are the only one who can decide when your sacrifice has reached its limit and when the time has come to stop being a pillar for a structure that was never built to last. When you look at the people around you today, are you holding them up because they are worth the weight? Or are you just terrified of what happens if you finally let go and let them see the truth for themselves?